Hello, my name is Adam Clark, and this is my capstone presentation for the University of St. Francis Physician Associate Program, and I am discussing the role of psilocybin in modern psychiatric medicine. Just making sure that we're all on the same page, I want to discuss what is psilocybin. So it's a compound that is found within all mushrooms of the psilocybe genus species. Technically, psilocybin is what we call a prodrug, meaning that on its own it has no active properties, but once it's metabolized into its constituent parts, namely psilocin, baeocystin, and norbaeocystin, these are what are causing the psychoactive properties of psilocybin. Now, throughout the presentation, I am going to be saying psilocybin, but for the sake of accuracy, realize this is not totally true. It's just a little more simple. This is a molecule which acts selectively at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. Wherever you find humans, you'll also find mushrooms of the psilocybe genus. You can see here that these two species alone have a pretty considerable global distribution, but there are over 150 species of psilocybe mushrooms, and they all contain psilocybin. Hallucinogenic mushrooms have been used by indigenous cultures for a very long time. In Mexico, the Aztec people would use psilocybin for divination purposes, namely to predict the outcomes of battles. And this is a practice that goes back at least hundreds of years and more likely thousands of years. However, during the 16th century, when Spanish imperialists were colonizing Mexico, they actively sought to snuff out mushroom use. They referred to it as the devil, and they declared its practice idolatrous. It is for this reason that for about 400 years afterward, psilocybin and mushroom use was unknown to the Western world. This changed in 1955 when a banker named Robert Gordon Wasson went down to Huautla de Jimenez, Mexico, where Maria Sabina lived, this woman I have pictured here, and he lied to her and said that he needed help finding his son, appealing to those divination elements of ritualistic psilocybin use. She obliged, and he went home and he wrote an article on his experience in Life magazine, and this caused an absolute explosion of interest in mushroom use. And the village where she came from, where Maria Sabina came from, became flooded with tourists. It kind of ruined her life, honestly, but that is how it got reintroduced to Western medicine. Now, interestingly, we have discovered LSD in 1943, so we had already been studying a very similar compound for several years. Nevertheless, psilocybin garnered its own interest from researchers, people like Timothy Leary, who had a psilocybin research institute through Harvard University. However, the early studies on psilocybin really lacked rigor. They were not very good at all. Famous experiments such as Marsh Chapel experiment were even found later on to have fabricated some of the data, especially to omit some of the negative experiences that some of the participants had. And so that even though, let's see, the PubMed shows that there were 232 studies on psilocybin between 1958 and 1970, we don't use any of those research at all because of their lack of rigor and their poor standards. So once psilocybin really started entering into the mainstream in a big way through the 60s, it was determined that this was something that had to be taken care of. And so after the Controlled Substance Act was passed in 1970, and the DEA was founded in 1973, we got our drug scheduling, and psilocybin was placed as a Schedule 1 drug immediately. Now, what this means is that it becomes very, very difficult to study psilocybin because it is under lock and key. You have to go through hoops in order to be able to study this, to say nothing, of course, of the legal ramifications of illegal use. But I want to discuss the DEA's criteria for a Schedule 1 drug. Number one, the drug has a high potential for abuse. Two, the drug has no currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States. And three, that there is a lack of accepted safety for the drug under medical supervision. And I really want you to keep this criteria in mind as we continue forward in this presentation. So while psilocybin research did continue at a slow trickle after its scheduling in 1973, um, nothing really substantial has come out. However, in 2018, the FDA designated psilocybin a breakthrough therapy. And what that means is that this therapy has the potential to work better than our existing therapies. And that really opened the door for research in a more substantial way. And here listed on the screen are just a few institutes that are doing serious research on psilocybin. And you can see there are some big hitters here: Johns Hopkins, Mass General. MAPS has some problems, but they have actually been doing consistent research since the 90s, I believe. Here is an incomplete list of some of the areas of research that psilocybin is being investigated for now. The, um, the bullet points with citations on them are the studies that I looked at for this presentation, but there are additional studies that I did not have the time to look into or which lack substantial data to include in this presentation. It's very important to talk about who should not take psilocybin. There are some contraindications that we know of already, and one of those is if a person has a history of psychosis or some psychotic disorder or a family history of those things. If someone has a family history of those things but has not had any sort of psychotic episodes themselves, this may induce their first psychotic episode, and if they do have a diagnosis, this may create an episode in them as well. Psilocybin creates a transient spike in your blood pressure, and while it's transient, it's fairly significant. And so people with an uncontrolled hypertension may be thrown into a hypertensive crisis if they take this substance that is contraindicated at this time. However, due to our lack of research, we don't know how psilocybin interacts with other medications, and there have not been large enough studies to show uh, contraindications or side effects that we just haven't seen yet. All right, now we're getting into the data, which I know everybody loves data. I love data. All right, so I'm going to have slides like this throughout the presentation so that you can see specifically what studies I'm referencing uh, in regards to a particular topic. And something I want you to look at though is the N there. The N value is the number of participants. That is a really crucial feature of all these studies, and you can take a look at those whenever this slide like this pops up. I'm also going to take the time to explain the general structure of psilocybin studies. I'm not going to go through every single one, but there is a pattern. So participants are given either a large dose or a small dose of psilocybin, and they undergo psychotherapy. Sometimes they get one single large dose, sometimes it's multiple doses, sometimes the small dose group gets a larger dose later on. That's called a crossover study. That's pretty common. And all of these studies are longitudinal. The shortest one was 4 weeks. Some of them go over a year. And throughout the studies, they will also be receiving psychotherapy without psilocybin, and they will be filling out various questionnaires that we use to score depression and anxiety. And so I'll point those out to you as we go forward. All right, so I'll also be including just one study per subject that is representational of the category, but they all really have the same exact pattern. So on this one, you can see here on the y-axis, this is the grid HAM-D, that's our depression scoring tool, and this is the length of the study itself. So in the beginning here, the baseline is pretty high on the score. If you look this up, you'll see it's like moderate to severe range. And down here, we get to a mild depression. It's not no depression, but it is a mild depression. And this effect is sustained throughout the course of the study. This is after 2 doses of psilocybin a few weeks apart, but beyond that, the participants did not receive any other doses, and we see that there is a sustained effect. So this is actually the area that awarded psilocybin the breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA. This is looking at patients who have terminal cancer diagnoses. All right, so here we have a few charts. I know it's a little overwhelming. Some of these are depression, some of these are anxiety. And what I want you to look at here, these points here represent baseline for low dose versus high dose groups. You can see the gap here between low dose and high dose groups, and the star indicates statistical significance. And then this is after the crossover when the low dose group received that high dose. And you can see that in all cases, the significance is removed and that all of the results level out after the high dose is given. This is from the same study. This is looking at response and remission rates, remission from depression and anxiety, not remission from cancer. But what I really think is super interesting about this slide in particular is right here, the remission rate at the 6-month mark is higher than it was initially. And I just think that is absolutely amazing. Same study again, this time looking at anxiety. You can see perhaps that there was a less of a remission from anxiety. Nevertheless, noting the difference between the low dose groups versus the high dose groups, and once again, remission, or I'm sorry, follow-up at 6 months for both remission and response were improved with anxiety. All right, moving on now to substance use disorders. All right, so for this study, you can see drinking days versus heavy drinking days for these participants. And in this little stretch here where things start to go down, this is where they were receiving psychotherapy alone. And here, boom, they get their psilocybin plus psychotherapy intervention, and bam, we have a precipitous fall for both drinking and heavy drinking days that is sustained at the 36 weeks mark. And once again, we're not at zero, right? It didn't completely cure these individuals. Nevertheless, their rates are significantly lower than they were prior to the therapy. And in another study that I read on the same topic, there was one participant who took one dose of the psilocybin, and he hated it. It was harrowing, worst experience of his entire life. And so he declined any further administration of psilocybin throughout the study. Nevertheless, he remained part of the study, he answered questionnaires, he continued to receive psychotherapy, and throughout the time for that study, it was 56 weeks. He did not drink any alcohol, and he went back to school, and he got a job during that time. And it was after one single administration of psilocybin. And while I understand that statistically that's not super impressive, the fact that it's possible at all is something that is definitely worth investigating further. All right, moving on to limitations. This comic sums it up pretty succinctly, some of the major issues with psilocybin studies. If you were paying attention to those N values on the slides that included them, you'll have seen that the largest N for all these studies was 59. And to my knowledge, that's the largest psilocybin study that has been done at all. The smallest was 3. These are minuscule numbers that mean that the research that we have done, consistent as the results may be, mean that it's not generalizable. We cannot extrapolate this out to a population level. And you know, like the slide before, that little comic, we don't have any way to create a control group. Right now, those in the control group are also receiving psilocybin, usually just in a smaller dose. Researchers know whether or not participants have received psilocybin, and the participants definitely know. And so we therefore lack blinding and sufficient control groups, which precludes us from participating or conducting studies that are randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard for all research. Additionally, and to further hone in on the lack of generalizability for these studies, basically every single participant was white, middle class, and well educated. And this really kind of reduces our generalizability to functionally zero. Nevertheless, the data that we have does show an excellent safety profile for psilocybin. There are reports of some participants having some issues with anxiety during the studies. However, these were easily ameliorated by the therapists who were on site conducting the psychotherapy. They were under supervision. Nobody was going out in the woods on their own to do this. And likewise, the efficacy of this is established through any study that you can find. The results are extremely consistent that there are long-term benefits for patients looking at depression and even substance abuse. With this in mind, that psilocybin has an excellent safety profile based on the data that we have currently available to us, and that the efficacy, despite small sample sizes, is quite consistent, let's revisit the DEA scheduling criteria for psilocybin. So, number one, the drug has a high potential for abuse. Well, not only does psilocybin not have a high potential for abuse, and I will show you another slide with data on that, but this can be used to treat substance use disorders. Furthermore, there is a mechanism of psilocybin use that prevents its daily use. Your brain will not allow you to take psilocybin every single day. So the rate of abuse for psilocybin is extremely low. All right, this data is a little bit old here, but you can see hallucinogens consistently, 0.1, 0.1, 0.1% of use substances of abuse. We have opiates here, and of course, we all know the opiate crisis. I'm sure that that number from 2015 is higher now than it was then, and this is a Schedule II drug, deemed less dangerous than psilocybin. Cocaine, also a Schedule II drug. Its medical accepted use, you might ask, is a topical analgesic, but we never use it that way. Nevertheless, it remains Schedule II. And then alcohol, clearly unscheduled, totally legal, but its rate of abuse is substantial and significantly higher. I doubt there's anybody who would watch this presentation that has not had a negative experience with alcohol themselves or knows somebody personally who has been really significantly impacted by alcohol. Moving on to the second point, that the drug has no currently accepted medical use and treatment. But the lack of accepted medical use is precluded by the scheduling itself. If we can't study the substance, then no medical consensus can be formed. The DEA does not have to request medical consensus or scientific consensus before scheduling the drug. They can schedule drugs before they are ever studied. And our mechanisms for rescheduling drugs are laborious. There is an executive process and there is a legislative process that both require enormous effort, but there's no current mechanism for revisiting the scheduling of drugs in instances like this, where we are reconsidering whether or not that scheduling is a reasonable one. All right, but nevertheless, I think that the possibility for establishing accepted medical use is becoming more and more realistic as we continue to study this, and organizations like Johns Hopkins kind of add legitimacy. And then the last point, that there is a lack of accepted safety for use of the drug under medical supervision. Well, I hope that if nothing else, the data that I have presented here today demonstrates that psilocybin is safe to use under medical supervision. All the participants here were accompanied by therapists and physicians during the administration of these substances, and there were no significant adverse effects. Psilocybin does not depress your breathing, it doesn't slow your heart rate, it doesn't damage any of your organs, and the largest risk lies in our contraindications and understanding who should not take this drug. To hammer the safety thing home a little bit more, here is a study conducted from the UK showing harm from various substances. No surprise here, alcohol is extremely high, heroin, cocaine, etc. And way at the end, you have mushrooms. So look, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm sure many of you out there have heard of this therapy, and there's a lot of hype around it at the moment. So What I'm not saying is that psilocybin is a cure-all, or that it will work for everything that it's being investigated for, or that it will work for every person who takes it. What I am saying is that to properly understand this drug and its potential to help people, we have to remove the barriers that are preventing us from studying it properly, and that means rescheduling psilocybin. We need to know one way or another whether or not this works. If we just look at depression alone, 8.4% of adults in the US meet the criteria for major depression. That is 21 million people. There are 132 suicides every single day in this country. That is 47,000 people dying by suicide every year. The therapies we have now are limited. And if we have something within an arm's reach that can make people better and prevent their deaths, we have an obligation to use it. And it is nothing short of tragic that we are being held back by institutions that are not beholden to medicine, science, or to people. I really hope that you liked this. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you would like a copy of my presentation, I would be glad to send it to you. You can email me at adamandrewclark@gmail.com. I have additional references and some slides from my live presentation, things like microdosing that I thought people would be interested in. If anybody has any questions, let me know. I could make more videos, or I could amend this one. And I really appreciate your time and your willingness to listen. Have a good day.